Hi everyone. Today, I think it's going to be our last lecture today. I hope you enjoyed them so far as much as it was possible, considering the circumstances we were facing. I think I was able to locate the maybe most appropriate uh, background for today. So that's going to be our background for today. Um, One quick thing before I begin our last topic, I will send, there is in the email that I've sent today also a link to the evaluations website, PICA, I think it's called PICA. As I said over the email, I will really appreciate if you take the time and go into this and provide some feedback on this course, especially since we had to do this transformation and go for an online platform. So if you have the time, the deadline, I think, is next Tuesday, as far as I remember, or next Wednesday. So whenever you have the time, I'll really appreciate if you can do that. Okay, so let's start today. Our last topic for this semester is ending, coincidentally, as with the topic of how terrorism ends, and we'll talk about that. First of all, as usual, a quick review. The last meeting on Monday was a discussion about the last type of new terrorism, the way that I defined them in this class. So we talked about lone wolf terrorism, the different definitions that we can use, mostly the debate whether and how the link between the individual who conducts the attack to any kind of terror group or any kind of social group can be part of the definition or not. The uniqueness of those types of individuals, very hard to detect, of course. Mostly I talked about with the theoretical aspect of collective action. That means that we don't have to convince a lot of people to take part in this action. There's just one individual. We don't have to convince him. He's going to do it himself. So that solves this collective action problem. And then we talked about the paper. The first paper was the Gill paper, trying to look at a lot of different categories and identify these profiles for lone wolves. It was very hard to actually find a very clear profile. Some of the factors that were more prevalent than others, so for example, the age. So lone wolf terrorists were older than the average. Most of them were unemployed, had a chronic problem of unemployment. They had background in illegal activities, which was very different from a lot of terror groups who try to avoid from those kinds of recruits because they don't want to raise red flags for any kind of military or police forces. And of course, the links to other networks, the more those individuals had links, whether it is, even if it's in the really early process, it was more beneficial to them. And then I talked about the Phillips paper, which compares the extent of damages, the lethality of lone versus group attacks. His main argument, just as a reminder, was that countries which have strong counterterrorism capabilities are actually more likely to experience more lone wolf terrorism because all those capabilities are less useful against an individual terrorist. And his evidence for that was mostly the subsample for the US cases and the French cases. So that's what we had. As I said, this is a very, very underexplored topic, which just getting into that, the main challenge is identifying these individuals, and that has also, of course, clear policy implications. So if you have any questions about that, you're more than welcome to send them to me. So today's topic is actually the ending topic for this course, and this is the end of terrorism. So there's a couple of puzzles that are actually conceptualized under this topic. We think about it, about the longevity of terror groups, how long groups are likely to survive. And a related question for that is trying to look at the different variations. Why do some individuals choose to remain or leave terror groups, and when are they more likely to leave the terror groups, which eventually lead to the group's demise? So those are the main questions that are addressed. The studies look at multiple aspects. So this is just some of the different factors we're going to talk about, different group attributes, whether it is the dynamics between groups or within groups, which again already gives you a hint to the some of the approaches we're going to talk about, the ideological approach, the psychological approach, the organizational approach, of course, and the political setting environment, which is the structural and strategic approach, which I'm going to mention later on today. We use all those different explanations in order to understand what makes terror groups more likely to survive longer, survive less, what makes individuals more likely to leave group or remain in the group. So one of the early work one of the earlier studies on this topic is a study by Ross and Gurr from the late 1980s. They argued that the main logic for the demise of terror group is that their coercive capabilities are diminished. And to explain that, they had two different explanations. The first is that there was an effective deterrent counterterrorism campaign, whether it is a preemptive campaign or just an attack after a series of terror incidents, which led to the group's demise. So the counterterrorism led to the end of the group. Their other argument was it was a burnout of the group due to a loss of popular support for the group. So the group that gets the public support for its operation were no longer getting this support, so they just burn out and ended. So those are the two basic arguments they made. And this actually, in a way, frames the entire discussion about looking at how terrorism is most likely to end. Either it is from the state side with effective counterterrorism actions, or whether it is from the group side, just a burnout and a loss of support, loss of recruits, loss of individuals, and then the end of operations. So when we think about the study of terror groups' duration or the end of terrorism, the main challenge in this case for us is how do we operationalize this concept of the end of terror groups? What does that mean? So there's a couple of ways to think about it. So one way to think about it, the group no longer exists or no longer uses violence, and the most appropriate measure for that is the number of attacks that the group is participating in or executes. Our quantity of interest, if you want to call that, the things that we're trying to measure, trying to estimate, is the likelihood of future attacks. So if the likelihood is lower, then it makes more sense that the groups no longer uses violence. So we can say that terrorism either demised or ended, whatever the way we want to think about it. And that's a study by, one study of that is the Jones and Libicki study, which I'm going to get to in a couple of minutes. Another way to think about it, which is a little bit more complicated, is when a group is removed from states or target states terror list, then it's no longer a terror group. There's a couple issues with that. First of all, in many of those lists, there's a high variation in subjectivity. For example, the FBI's terrorism list is very involves a lot of variation between groups. And in essence, it actually measures the extent of a state's motivation to put some group on that list, and not necessarily the group's motivation to keep its operations. Because a group like Hezbollah, for example, was not on the U.S. Terror group list for a lot of years, even after it started to conduct its operations in the Middle East. So sometimes it's mostly the motivation of the administration or the government in place if they want to put the terror group on the list. And here we also have political motivation. So that does not necessarily point to the fact that the terror groups has stopped. By the fact that the group is no longer on the list does not necessarily mean that it stopped its operation. It might be actually a more political incentive by the country that removed it from its own list. So those are two ways to think about the end of terror groups. Another one is another big topic that scholars are studying is what's called terrorism campaigns. And there's a lot of different methods that can lead to the end of the terror groups that are engaged in a serious campaign. And this is Cronin, which wrote one of the most important books about terror groups duration and the end of terrorism in this case. There's a lot of methods here. We talked about a lot of them: legal decapitation, negotiations. We talked about repression, success, which is when a group is able to accomplish some of its political objectives, so they can no longer operate as a terror group, but they were able to accomplish. It can be a failure, which is exactly the opposite in this case. Reorientation mostly means that the group transition or substitutes to a different form of violence, whether it is different violence, whether it's moving from reorientation can be also like a subset of negotiation on some level. And the last method here is what's called cross-generational failure. This is the inability of the terror groups, of the members of the group, to sustain the struggle over time. So when the older individuals who are still part of the group are unable to sustain or move on their goals and their operations with the younger generation of terror operators, then the group may actually fail and no longer operate. Here, this is from the book. This is an example for some of those groups and how they actually demise. We're familiar with many of those groups. So decapitation of leaders, we saw about the Shining Path, the Real IRA, both of them ended with the loss of leaders, negotiations with the end of the PLO, today came in a different format, or the Colombian rebel group FARC. There's success for some groups, we'll talk about that. There's failure which led to some groups' demise. Cross-generational failure is interesting in this case, such as the Weather Underground. In this case, is one of the groups that they were unable to sustain their goals and their fight beyond the older individuals, so the groups just died out in a way. And there's reorientation, and you can see there's some groups here in this list that some of them reoriented towards more of a criminal actions, some of them toward the more extreme version of a full insurgency. This is just a couple of examples of the way that some groups that we are familiar with, some of them we're less familiar with, demised over the years. All right, so the research on this topic is rather extended, and there's some interesting findings. For example, there are some groups that demise and come back or return to the scene in this case. So the PKK, the Turkish rebel group, ended its operations when its leader, Abdullah Öcalan, they went through the method of leader decapitation. The leader was arrested in the late 1990s. He was sentenced to death in 1999, but since then this sentence has been reversed and he's alive in prison in Turkey. But according to data from the last 10 years, the groups actually reemerged, and since some point in 2010, they have conducted multiple attacks. So this is a group that lost its leader, who no longer did not operate for many years, and then came back to the scene. That's one interesting finding from research about this topic. Another one is that some of those demise mechanisms have uncertain effects that may be permanent or just temporary effects. For example, we talked a lot about leader decapitation. So leader decapitation, especially using military force and trying to kill the leaders, usually lead to a short-term demise. So the group is unable to operate in the short term, but in the long term, and we talked about in the context of both ideological, but mostly organizational explanations, the new leaderships will actually prepare more attacks. Why? Because they have to show that they are the leadership that is able to promote the group's goals. So there's a lot of internal dynamics within the groups that, based on new leaders coming into power, might lead in the long term to actually, instead of the group demising, to actually the groups resurfacing and initiating even more extreme types of attacks. So that's another finding in this case. There's some mechanisms that operate simultaneously or sequentially in this case. So in the examples of the PIRA, the Provisional IRA in Ireland, eventually demised after negotiations, which led to its inclusion in the political system in Ireland. But that has been after many, many years of unsuccessful repression by the British military forces. The LTTE, which is the rebel groups in Sri Lanka, actually went through a series of many negotiation attempts with the government in Sri Lanka until eventually the government lost its patience and launched a massive counterterrorism campaign in the early 1980s. They killed the leader and eventually led to the group's demise. So this is just different ways how some of those mechanisms might work at the same time. They might work one after another. After a failure of one, another one will be successful. Those are some of the findings that we have. So as I promised, we came back to the Johnson-Libicki study to think about the two primary mechanisms that are used to explain the demise of groups. The one of them is from the group's perspective. The other one is from the target state's perspective. First, from the group's perspective, is mostly joining the political process. This mechanism is more likely to take place when the group has more kind of a limited political objectives. If the objective of the groups is to get representation in the parliament of the target state, whether it is getting some territorial autonomy, they're more likely to achieve that group and then stop their operation as a terror group than other more larger extent goals. From the state's point of view, group's demise is less likely when it comes to extensive military repression campaign. It's more likely when the counterterrorism campaign is based on intelligence and specific police efforts in this case. There's also other factors which are specific to the group, which may lead to groups' demise later or not. We'll talk about that. One of them is ideology, and we'll talk about the religious ideology. And the other one is size. So groups who are larger are more likely to survive. So this is some of the findings that they talk about, but we're using those two main demise mechanisms in order to conceptualize the way we talk about why would terror groups actually no longer be able to survive. We'll do that as we did in most of the topics throughout this course by going over not all, but most of the theoretical approaches and try to explain them. So as always, we start with this strategic approach. The logic, of course, is the rational choice approach. The groups is aspiring to accomplish political goals. If the members of the terror groups are rational, the way that we conceptualize rational behavior, then if they're able to achieve any one of their political objectives, not necessarily their top political objective, but one of them, of those objectives in this ordering of their objectives, then they should be able to accomplish their goal and then stop operating as a terror group. One example for that is when the groups are able to join the political process and therefore they cease violence because this is one of their goals. It's not necessarily their most important goals, but it's one of them. The example in this case is what's called the Irgun, which was a group which operated in Israel before Israel gained its independence. Israel was under the control of the British Mandate. The group's main goal, or one of the main goals, was to lead to the British exit from this territory and accomplishing the state of Israel in this territory. When the British eventually left and the British mandate ended in the late 1947, then it was able to accomplish its goal and join the political process in the new state of Israel. The other one is the ANC, which was established in South Africa in 1912 as part of the fight against the oppression of the blacks in South Africa. It began using terror tactics in the 1960s, sustained it actually all the way through the 1990s. In 1990, it joined the political process when it actually was able to accomplish their goal, which was to end the illegal apartheid in South Africa. So this is just one example how the accomplishment of one of the political objectives led to the group's demise. We can think about that also in the context of the country, the state that tries to stop terrorism from occurring in its area. So a group can be led to its demise when the country adopts a counterterrorism policy that accepts bargaining as some option. So now when we go into a bargaining with the terror organizations, the state cannot fully concede to all the terror groups demand because it sets the precedence of violence works. So other groups will see that they will be able to use violence in order to accomplish their own objectives. But if the group and the state is able to identify that the group has some negotiable objectives, then a solution which is going to lead to the end of violence is possible. And the clearest example in this case is the groups that have the goal of political autonomy are more likely to accept negotiations, go into negotiations, and then in the future to the end of their use of violence. So this is just one example. From the group's perspective, accepting this kind of solution, it's not accomplishing their main goal, but it allows them to bargain for one of those objectives, which again fits with the rational actor framework. There may be a situation where there is problems during this bargaining process, during those negotiations, and those tensions are in a way replacing the violence. It can be a factor of internal dynamics within the groups because they're unable to accept some of the solutions offered by the negotiation process. So that's one of the potential things that can happen during this stage. There might be some level of violence during a negotiation process, but again, still more likely than not lead to the group's demise. Now, we also talk in this set of explanations, so why would the individuals leave the group? And in this case, We can use strategic explanation and rational choices if the individuals that operates within a group no longer views the use of violence or the way that the group operates as promoting their own goals, then they're more likely to abandon it, which again is very generally a strategic utility-based explanation, but of course it has a lot of idiosyncratic and personal factors which are also part of this decision. Moving on to the other approach, with a closely related, of course, to the strategic approach, which is the structural approach. Overall, when we talked about the structural approach, we talked about a rational decision, the effect of structural conditions to lead to a rational decision. In this case, how do different structural conditions lead to the rational decision of a group to no longer operate as a terror group? We talked mostly about two main factors, and today we'll talk about them as well. So this is the first, is regime type. Since democracies offer many more legitimate channels for individuals to sound their grievances, it's more likely that terror groups will not last long in democracies, again, because rational individuals will understand that it's much more useful to express their grievances through other channels and not through violence. But the systematic evidence for this, and we talked about this a lot even before we went into the online format, is hard to find, and that's based on the different measures. How do we measure the group? How do we measure the number of attacks? What type of attacks are part of our measure? So that makes it much harder to find support to the argument that a regime type is related to a drop in the operations of terrorism. One of the studies that did try to think about the structural factors such as regime type in the context of the duration of terror groups, or why terrorism ends, is the Young and Dugan paper. They find that the average lifespan for terror groups is about 3 years. At the same time, over half of the groups in their over 2,000 group sample actually stopped their operations after the first year. They also show that the survival of the certain types of regime, whether it is democracy or autocracy, in most cases those are different regimes, is associated with the length of the group survival. So regimes who survive longer actually are facing terror groups which also survive longer. Some of their data also talked about the duration of groups to different clusters or different regions in which those groups operated. For example, in areas, according to the data they used, in the areas of Asia or the Americas, so that's Central America and South America, the duration of survival was relatively short, around 1 year. A related study by Bloomberg, which actually was published earlier in about 2011, used different types of data, but also had some similar findings in terms of those clusters of countries where terror groups operate. They found that groups in sub-Saharan Africa actually survive longer than those that operate in America. So again, those clusters of explanations are not directly evidence for regime type, but many of those regions have similar types of regimes. So that's like pretty much an indirect evidence for this effect. Looking at more specific cases provide us a little bit better evidence for the regime type. And for this case, we'll take the Alonso paper from 2011. He studied the demise of the ETA group in Spain and showed that the transition from autocracy to democracy, from dictatorship to democracy, was followed by many members of the ETA group leaving the group. They also provided the autonomy rights in the Basque region, which again, overall reduced the extent of support for violence for members of this group. So essentially what he argued is that the change in the regime led on some level to internal splits between the radical factions and the less radical factions in the terror groups, and eventually to the group's demise. So this is just one example for that. Another structural factor is the state capability factor, capabilities. So there is a relatively high extent of correlation between increased economic development and a shorter duration of survival. And the main measure it's used is GDP per capita. If we think about this measure, it might indicate two processes that lead to the demise of groups. The first one of them is that this measure, which is economic development, in this case it's a measure for strong economy, is highly correlated with strong counterterrorism capability, which suggests that the reason that those groups are ending is not because of the strong economy, but it's actually because of the strong counterterrorism capabilities. So that actually refutes this argument. A more supportive argument in this case is because of the economic development, there's a lot more opportunities for individuals to engage in, to get a lot of benefits from those economic developments, so they decide not to participate in terrorism. So that's where that comes into play. This is just one evidence for the problems of structural theories and the measures that we select. So if you use a measure which is very, very indirect, it's hard to show its direct effect on our dependent variable in this case, which is the number of attacks or how likely the group is to survive. A related factor in this case is, of course, is globalization. So the global interdependency allows terror groups a lot more access or easier access to resources, financing, and recruits, which the effect in this case is actually a negative effect on our question, which is the likelihood of demise. So the more access groups has because of this globalization, the less likely they are to end. And this is the part of the Vittori paper, which we'll get back to later on. Moving on to organizational approach, the main argument is that the more dense the environment is, survival is more important for groups, but groups which are operating in a less dense environment are actually more likely to survive. And that brings us back to the Young and Dugan paper. They found the model number of groups that can coexist at the same time is about 11. If this number rises too substantially, in this case, this number is 15, that the survival rate reduces substantially by more than 10%, which is a pretty significant number. For example, we can think about all the groups that operated in Israel during the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. So the main group was Hamas, which was able to attract most of the supporters and the recruits, mostly due to the use of tactics such as outbidding, also turned to the fact that it's the one of the older groups and the more popular groups. And that increased the risk of how likely a group is to survive, especially for the smaller groups such as the PFLP, which was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So when there's a too high number of groups and the environment is too dense, it's much harder, especially for the smaller groups, to survive. There's a positive correlation between high extent of rivalry and group survival. So the more groups are able to fight as part of the survival, they're more likely, as part of the rivalry, they're more likely to survive. But this is also contingent upon an additional factor in this case, which is the innovation. Because if there's a stiff competition, there's rivalry, groups need to adapt and innovate, and that improves their survival odds. It's not that the rivalry itself improved their survival odds, because rivalry actually makes it harder for some groups, just as I talked about in the previous slide. If those groups facing rivalry are also able to innovate substantially, they're more likely to attract popular support, get recruits, and more likely to survive. And the example in this case is the way that the FARC was able to operate in Colombia. Age studies have shown that older groups, of course, survive longer, which is not really a finding. It's not even a very strong argument in this case. But for example, the study by Bloomberg from 2010 showed that the vast majority of attacks from the 1970s to the early 2000s were actually executed by what can be termed as one-hit wonders, which is groups which survived very, very short amount of time. They made this attack and they were unable to make additional attacks. Groups that were able to survive beyond this single shot or very short period of time, actually constructing what can be seen as some kind of a small monopoly of the surviving groups. And those groups, in a way, operate together, allows them to survive in the long term. So this is a figure on the number of groups from the Bloomberg paper. And as you can see, there's a peaks, and there's some peaks at some points when there's a many number of organizations, and there's of course valleys when there's a short number. The peak is 578 in the early 1990s, and as low as a little over 50 in 2001. So this is changing all the time, and that shows that there's a lot of groups that do not survive past 1 or 2 attacks. An important organizational factor is the ability to generate or to create external links, because it provides access to resources, to financing, to recruits. All this, of course, improves the survival probabilities. How do groups able to create those things? It can be state sponsorship. So that's the support that Iran provides to Hezbollah, allows it to survive for so many years, provides all those things, provides resources, provides its money, provides its recruits. Another way is by going into an alliance with other terror groups, which provides, again, more resources. It provides the ability to coordinate attacks, so you can make even larger extent of attacks with different groups. And again, it increases the survival odds for those groups. The main risk in this case is a higher likelihood of detection or being followed by any kind of police organizations, police forces or military forces. But those risks of detection are compensated by the increase in resources and the ability to coordinate those attacks. So in most cases, it's worth it for them to go into alliances. A relevant factor in this case is structural leadership. So the internal structure of the group, the leadership impacts the survival rates. 2012 study by Victor Assal and his associates showed that the group which has factional leadership, which has a lot of internal rivalry, are less likely to survive compared to those who have a more coherent leadership structure. Decentralized groups are less likely to survive than hierarchical groups, mostly because leaders have less control over other members of the groups, and there's a possibility of splitting the group, or defections are more likely in this kind of situations. So that's how the structure of the group impacts the survival probabilities. Going into the next set of explanation, in this case, we're going to the ideological approach. Religion, of course, is a very powerful ideology that enables, according to the Jones and Libicki paper that I mentioned early on, allows groups to survive for longer periods of time. The logic is that religion offers for a group what can be seen as a ready-made constituency, which provide to them support and provide recruits. So there's a lot of people that follow the same religion. So all those people are more likely to support the group. All those people are more likely, or many of those people are more likely to join the terror group, which again improves the odds of survival. The shared or religious ideology in this case does not need to be replenished, and it's a very strong bond between the population that supports the groups and provides recruits to the group itself. All of those things together increase the survival odds for the terror group. A nationalist ideology is also related to a longer duration of groups' operations. It's not only the strong bond with a certain population, a constituency that lives in those areas where the fight for a nationalist ideology takes place. It's also the potential for a territorial sanctuary that makes these groups more likely to persist longer. So nationalist ideology is similar to religious ideology. It's a very strong ideology which provide the improved odds for survival in the long term. Then we have the more political ideologies in this case. So the left-wing ideology are the least durable, mostly because it's difficult to recruit many individuals and deliver the message across many generations. We saw that a lot with the communist terror groups in Europe. Right-wing groups also face problems in terms of persuading many recruits to join, because they have to convince people to join and persuade them about the appeal of their ideology, which is not always that straightforward, especially if we compare them to religious ideologies. This is the data regarding different ideologies from the Vittori paper. So as you can see here, the dark bars represent a long-term survival over 10 years, and the religious ideology in this case is the most powerful one compared to right-wing, which are more likely to survive just the first year and not much after that. The nationalist group also have a longer survival probabilities. There's a lot more groups who are able to survive in this case. So this is one of the things that we can find in this in this data. A few more points related to the survival of religious groups. So some argue that while those groups are more likely to survive, it means that they are unable to accomplish any of their goals. But the problem here is the question, what exactly are the goals that we're looking at? Because as I've mentioned, when I talked about Al-Qaeda a couple of weeks ago, Al-Qaeda has shifted its goals since the 1980s to the 2000s and until this moment now. So it may be that the groups shifted its own goals in order to ensure its own survival. So it's hard to argue in this case that the religion led to the group survival. It was more actually a strategic, utility-based argument that the group was able to adjust its goals in order to ensure its survival. And ideology has, of course, as a religious ideology, has the strong staying power in this case, which is based on sacred and spiritual motivations. And the link to a supernatural force, because it's a religious ideology, makes it less likely that they will lose a lot of the supporters, even if the country that's fighting against these terror groups is implementing a very harsh repression. So repression is even less likely to be effective in the face of religious ideology. If we look at why would individuals leave, so a couple of studies looked at that, and some have found regarding the individuals that deserted ETA in Spain that their time in prison actually was beneficial to their decision to leave the group, but the explanation was not the ideology-based explanation, it's mostly utility view. They found that because of the change in the political conditions that violence is less useful, and they are more likely to keep pursuing the ideology that ETA was trying to promote, but instead of using violence, using other methods. So this was a semi-related answer to this aspect, but it's related to ideological explanations, but the explanation itself is actually more based on utility and strategic calculations. Finally, the psychological approach, as always, identifying clear individual mechanisms is very, very hard. Why? We talked a lot about the psychological approach. There's a lot of different motivations to join terrorism. So that also means there's potentially many, many motivations to leave terrorism in this case. But still, some studies were able to show some clusters of explanations. For example, the study by Dalgaard and Nielsen from 2013 argued that many of the individuals decide to leave the terror groups after actually causing personal harm, after executing some kind of an attack which led to casualties. And the reasons are different types of doubts, whether these ideological ones, personal ones, or even doubts regarding the way that the group operates. Now, those different clusters of explanations are not independent. They actually related to each other. It leads to an overall more of a debate regarding this whole viewpoint of us versus the world that many of those groups are trying to promote, whether it's actually justified and whether violence is the best tool to accomplish the goals that the group is trying to push for. One of the important arguments that they made is that increased contact of those individuals with the outside world makes these doubts even stronger, because individuals are actually exposed to reality and not just the message that the group is trying to promote. And this final argument in this case has some application to counterterrorism policy, because the more we integrate individuals into the society and into reality in this case, the more likely we are to push them away from terror groups. Before I go into the final couple of slides here, talk about policy measures, I want to just stop for the attendance word. This is our last attendance word for this semester. I'm going to use the word summer for this semester. So summer, which is already here because it's very hot outside, is our attendance word for today. Finally, talking about policy. So we know that no one single factor can explain the decline of terrorism. I just talked about it now for over 35 minutes, providing you multiple explanations. So structural explanations provide us some evidence, but we are suspect of the measures. Ideological explanations can help us understand why terrorism will decline, but it's mostly also joined by other factors, whether it is psychological ones or organizational ones. Some of the organizational explanations are more promising, for example, talking about the size of the group or the extent of connections that the group has, or if we link between size and we also think about ideology. So a religious or ethno-national ideology along with size are more likely to predict groups to survive longer. So those are just some of those explanations, but still we cannot identify one single factor to explain that. There's a variety of policy tools that can be used. The more effective one that has been used in the past is intelligence work, police work, going into political negotiations with terror groups and using different economic tools such as sanctions. But the main challenge in this case is that we need to design an effective policy which accounts for as much relevant factors or attributes as possible, accounting also for the context in which the groups operate. Because if we just design a very general approach, it's less likely to be effective. A few other points here. The data have shown us that a lot of the groups tend to decline during or right after the first year. So from a policy standpoint, the argument is that we need to emphasize the counterterrorism aspect of local police forces and local intelligence operations. The reason for that, those forces have more intimate knowledge of those groups and also of the environment in which they operate. They're more familiar with them, with the environmental conditions. They're more likely to be successful. If we're using extended, very large-scale military forces, they are more likely to backfire, and also it has own normative and ethical concerns. Mostly, they're less likely to be effective, especially in such a short period of time. So this is another point related to, based on the data that we have regarding the survival of groups, what type of measures are more effective. Globalization provided, as I said, a lot of benefits to terror groups, but this growing in a global interdependency has its own benefits also for states who fight terrorism. It allows much more cooperation between countries, allows to share intelligence, to share defense practices, and the example for that, you saw that at the end of the first movie that we saw back in class, about the airline passengers list that the US had for a while, and they were able to share that with the Europeans eventually. So again, the more global interconnections between countries allows us to create a more coordinated campaign against terrorism. Other solutions such as negotiation is more likely to be effective if the country is able to identify the group's objectives, such as autonomy. If autonomy is one of the goals of the group, then they're more likely to be successful, and we are more likely to be successful if we implement negotiations. And when we talk specifically about how to convince individuals to leave terror groups, then we talked about a lot, different CVE, countering violent extremism programs, and de-radicalization that we have mentioned numerous times. In her study about the end of terrorism, this is one of the main points that Audrey Cronin is trying to promote. Terrorism doesn't really end ever, just like wars usually do not end, many wars. But at the same time, we can reduce terrorism, we can manage the extent of terrorism, and that depends mostly on the ability to design policies that are more nuanced, that they are proportional, and they're able to contain violent groups and motivate them toward a path of conciliation. So large-scale policies are less likely to be successful compared to more specific and nuanced proportional strategies in this case. That's it, folks. That's the study. That's what I have for today. If we look at the entire course and everything that we've had when we were still in class for the first about 7 weeks that we had early on, and everything that I did online with you over the last 8 weeks, the bottom line regarding everything we know about terrorism is that we know a lot about terrorism, but at the same time, there's still a lot more we need to learn. And the argument, why is it so complicated to find a solution? Why is it so complicated to understand the motivation for terrorism, whether it is individuals, groups, or whatever? And I've mentioned that also. Terrorism is a social phenomenon, so it makes it extremely complex for us to identify a single causal factor. We can identify a lot of categories of factors, but a single causal factor, which has its own implications for policy, is very hard to come by. So that's my finale. I'll remind you again to send the tasks by Monday, this upcoming Monday. Send me by email, both the paper and the presentation. If you please have the time to go into filling the course evaluation, I also appreciate that. And one more thing, I'll come back later this week, either tomorrow on Friday, with a very, very quick video just to wrap up everything and just to say thank you for being patient with me and working with this different platform, and to say goodbye. So with that, I'll finish for today. And with the Aguilan background, I will tell you all goodbye.